Welcome back to Echo Report, bringing you the latest news from around the world. As the summer of 2025 draws to a close, the United States finds itself at the heart of a constitutional crisis, one not sparked by scandal or corruption, but by a fundamental question: who truly holds the power to shape the nation's economic destiny? Is it the president, with the authority to act swiftly in times of perceived emergency, or Congress, entrusted by the Constitution with the power to levy taxes and regulate trade? This tug-of-war over tariffs has become the defining issue of the season, capturing the attention of lawmakers, legal scholars, and everyday Americans alike. President Trump, citing urgent threats to national security and economic stability, invoked sweeping emergency powers to impose tariffs on goods from more than 90 countries. By bypassing Congress, he set off a firestorm of debate and a high-stakes legal and political confrontation. The move was unprecedented in its scope, raising questions about the limits of executive authority and the role of checks and balances in American government. Now, the nation waits anxiously as federal courts weigh whether a president can use emergency declarations to enact what amounts to broad taxation, a power the framers of the Constitution explicitly reserved for Congress. Legal experts argue both sides, with some warning that a ruling in favor of the president could set a precedent for future leaders to sidestep legislative oversight on critical economic matters. Across the country, the public is deeply divided. Supporters of the president's actions see them as bold protectionism, a necessary step to defend American industries and jobs in a rapidly changing global economy. Critics, however, warn that this is a dangerous overreach, one that threatens the delicate balance of power and the very foundation of American democracy. Meanwhile, the real-world impact is being felt by businesses and consumers alike. Small business owners struggle with rising costs and supply chain disruptions, while families see prices climb at the grocery store. Factories, slow production, and uncertainty ripples through ports and warehouses. Internationally, America's trading partners watch closely, and global tensions simmer as the world waits to see how the crisis will unfold. The stakes could not be higher. At issue is not just the fate of billions of dollars in tariffs, but the future balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. The outcome will shape how America governs itself in times of crisis and set the tone for future presidents and Congresses. At the center of it all is Voss Selections v. United States, a case now before the Supreme Court. Legal teams, journalists, and citizens gather outside the courthouse, aware that the decision could become a defining moment in constitutional law. The outcome of this case will not only determine the immediate future of American trade policy, but will also define the boundaries of presidential power for generations to come, leaving a lasting mark on the nation's constitutional landscape. The power to tax is the foundation of democratic governance, rooted in the principle of no taxation without representation. The Constitution grants this authority to Congress, ensuring taxation decisions are made by elected representatives, not a single executive. Tariffs, as taxes on imports, shape the economy and society, making control over them a core issue. Allowing a president to impose broad tariffs via emergency powers bypasses public debate and legislative oversight. Supporters argue this enables swift action. Critics warn it risks unchecked executive power. The real question: who decides, Congress or the president? The answer will shape American democracy's future. This struggle is about preserving the principle that taxation must remain in the hands of the people's representatives. In early 2025, President Trump made a dramatic escalation in his trade policy, announcing sweeping tariffs on imports from over 90 countries. The move sent shockwaves through global markets and left both allies and rivals scrambling to respond. For many, it marked a turning point in America's approach to international commerce, signaling a willingness to use economic power as a tool of national policy on an unprecedented scale. To justify this sweeping action, the president invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, declaring that persistent trade deficits and the ongoing crisis of illicit fentanyl imports constituted national emergencies. This legal maneuver allowed the administration to bypass traditional legislative hurdles and act swiftly, but it also raised immediate questions about the scope and intent of emergency powers. Supporters of the tariffs hailed the decision as a bold and necessary step to protect American jobs, industries, and communities that have long felt left behind by globalization. They argue that Congress has been too slow or unwilling to address these urgent economic threats, and that decisive executive action was overdue. But critics, including many legal scholars and lawmakers, counter that neither trade deficits nor the fentanyl crisis meet IEPA's original definition of a national emergency. They warn that the law was never intended to serve as a blank check for broad trade policy, and that stretching its meaning could undermine the very foundation of American democracy. These opponents caution that such a precedent could open the door for future presidents to sidestep Congress on major economic decisions, eroding the separation of powers and weakening the legislative branch's role in shaping the nation's economic future. At its core, the debate is less about the specific tariffs and more about the legitimacy of the process, about who gets to decide when and how America wields its economic might. This is a fundamental clash between an increasingly powerful executive branch and the constitutional order of checks and balances that has defined American government for centuries. The outcome of this standoff will not only shape the future of presidential authority and American trade policy, but could also redefine the boundaries of emergency powers for generations to come. In the end, the question remains, was this a moment of bold leadership in a time of crisis, or a dangerous step toward executive overreach that could alter the balance of American democracy? The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to tax and regulate commerce, a safeguard against executive overreach. This design ensures taxation reflects the will of the people through debate and compromise. The president's role is to execute laws and negotiate trade, with limited specific tariff authority delegated by Congress. Critics argue President Trump's sweeping tariffs stretch this delegated power beyond its limits, seizing a core legislative function. The legal question, can a general emergency override Congress's explicit authority? The answer will determine if the framers' balance of power endures, or if executive power expands. President Trump's legal basis for tariffs is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, passed in 1977. IEPA lets the president regulate economic transactions after declaring a national emergency from foreign threats. The administration claims trade deficits and fentanyl imports qualify, granting broad authority, including tariffs. Opponents argue IEPA was meant for targeted sanctions, not sweeping trade policy, and doesn't mention tariffs. The courts must decide, does IEPA empower the president to bypass Congress on tariffs, or is this a misuse of emergency powers? The ruling will define IEPA's reach for decades. The legal fight centers on Voss Selections versus United States, brought by small businesses and states hurt by the tariffs. Plaintiffs argue the president's use of IEPA is unconstitutional, trade deficits aren't emergencies, and only Congress can levy tariffs. They say the president has turned a targeted sanctions law into a sweeping tax regime. The administration counters that IEPA's broad language gives the president discretion to address economic threats, including tariffs. The case is a classic separation of powers battle, with the judiciary asked to enforce constitutional limits. The outcome will clarify the scope of IEPA and the balance of power in trade and taxation. Voss Selections could become a defining moment for American governance. The tariffs' impact is felt everywhere. Higher prices for families squeeze small businesses and disrupted supply chains. Consumers pay more for everyday goods, straining household budgets. Small businesses face rising costs and tough choices, absorb losses, raise prices, or cut jobs. Global supply chains are thrown into chaos, forcing companies to rethink operations and investments. The administration argues these pains are necessary to protect American industry, but many economists warn of lasting harm. Tariffs act as a tax on domestic production and invite foreign retaliation, hurting U.S. exporters. The government's tariff revenue comes directly from American pockets. The economic legacy will depend on whether the benefits outweigh the widespread costs. The legal battle of Voss Selections versus United States began in the stately halls of the Court of International Trade, a specialized federal court tasked with resolving complex disputes over trade and tariffs. This case quickly captured national attention, as it challenged the very foundation of the administration's authority to impose sweeping tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The court's initial ruling declared the tariffs unlawful under IEEPA, sending shockwaves through legal and political circles. Unwilling to accept defeat, the administration promptly filed an appeal, setting the stage for a high-stakes legal showdown. As the case moved to the federal circuit, the appellate judges decided that the tariffs would remain in effect during the review process. a decision that kept businesses and policymakers on edge. During oral arguments, judges openly questioned whether trade deficits truly constituted a national emergency, expressing skepticism about the administration's justification for invoking IEEPA in this context. They also pointed out that IEEPA itself is notably silent on the use of tariffs as a remedy, raising further doubts about the government's legal rationale. With the nation watching, anticipation builds as a decision from the Federal Circuit is expected soon. The outcome could have far-reaching consequences for trade policy and executive power, yet both sides acknowledge that the legal journey is far from over. No matter the result, all eyes are on the Supreme Court, which is widely expected to have the final word on this landmark dispute. At its core, the case raises profound questions about the separation of powers in the American system of government and the extent of Congress's authority to tax and regulate commerce. Lawmakers and legal scholars alike are closely following the proceedings, aware that the outcome could redefine the balance between the legislative and executive branches. The Supreme Court's upcoming term could feature one of the most significant rulings of the decade, with implications that may shape American law and governance for years to come. The judiciary's vital role as a check on executive power is on full display, reminding the nation of the importance of an independent court system. Whatever the final verdict, it will set a binding precedent that could influence generations of legal thought and government action. Ultimately, Voss' selection stands as a testament to the enduring power of the rule of law and the ongoing struggle to define the limits of governmental authority in a changing world. The Supreme Court's decision in this tariff battle will shape American governance for decades. If the court sides with the administration, presidential power expands. Future presidents could bypass Congress on major economic issues. Critics warn this erodes checks and balances, while supporters see a more agile executive. A win for the challengers reaffirms Congress's authority and limits emergency powers, forcing cooperation on trade and tax laws. The ruling will echo far beyond tariffs, defining the nature of American democracy and the rule of law. Will power remain divided or shift toward unilateral executive action? The consequences will touch the economy, political stability, and the nation's constitutional identity. The outcome will be a defining moment for 21st century American government.